This notice confirms that your electrical service connection crossing Crestwood community property has been terminated, effective immediately, for failure to obtain required HOA utility easement approval. Do not attempt to restore service without written board authorization. I read that note 3 times, standing in the gravel outside my shop, and the only sound I could pick out over the wind coming down off the ridge was my daughter's voice, still in my ear from 20 minutes before, telling me the lights had gone out and she didn't know why. Her name was Tess, and she was 16, and she was alone in that house. What Diane Marsh did not know when she hired that contractor to cut my service line on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 2023 was that the easement those lines ran through had been recorded at the county clerk's office in 1987, 3 years before Crestwood's founding developer broke ground, and 32 years before her HOA ever incorporated. She did not know that the same shared line tap her development used to power its front gate ran from my side of that easement, confirmed in county utility records, and that her husband Gerald had been quietly trying to get his hands on my parcel for 4 years. She had the clipboard and the authority and the contractor with the linesman pliers, and she had never once looked up the deed. So let me ask you something. If you had spent 10 years building a small business on inherited land, kept every fine letter in a labeled folder, documented every visit from every inspector, and known from the day you took title that you held a recorded access right older than the organization trying to take your power, what would you have done when the lights went out? I'll tell you what I did. I drove home in the dark, sat with Tess at the kitchen table, and made a phone call that ended Diane Marsh's run as HOA president, and shut off the light at her development's front gate for good. My name is Kyle Brooks. I turned 52 last September. I spent 24 years as a journeyman lineman, mostly distribution work, some transmission, a couple of stints doing storm restoration in places that had been hit hard. I retired from the line crew in 2015 when my knees told me I had one more season in me at best, and I used the first year off to convert my father's old equipment shed on this 2.4-acre parcel into a small engine repair shop. Lawn mowers, generators, chainsaws, the occasional riding tractor. Nothing complicated, nothing fancy, just work I understood, and a building I already owned, free and clear. My father, Dale Brooks, had bought this land in 1979. It sat at the southwest corner of what would eventually become the Crestwood development. Though, when he bought it, there was nothing out here but a gravel road, a tree line, and a power company service drop that ran across the adjacent parcel, because the direct route to my father's building was cheaper that way. In 1987, he had the county surveyor walk the line, and he recorded a private easement granting him and his heirs access across that strip of adjacent land for the purpose of power line maintenance, repair, and uninterrupted service. The county clerk stamped it. My father put the original in an accordion folder inside a fireproof box in his workshop. He told me about it when I was a teenager, not because he expected trouble, but because he was the kind of man who believed the deed was a working document, not a souvenir. He died in 2007. My mother had gone 2 years before. I inherited the property and the shop in 2009. And when I sat down with the deed packet that first week, I found the easement right where he'd said it would be. I read the whole thing, legal description and all, and I made a copy, dated it, put the copy in a manila folder marked 2009, and the original back in the box. That was my father's habit, and it became mine. I ran the shop for 10 years before Crestwood HOA became my problem. They had incorporated in 2019, absorbing the development to my east and north. And right away, I noticed the aesthetic upgrade. The front gate at their entry road got a new keypad box and a motorized arm. The landscaping along their perimeter fence tightened up. And Diane Marsh who had moved into the development 3 years earlier with her husband Gerald, was elected board president that spring. Owen Ridley, who had lived 2 lots east of me for years and had done county survey work before he retired, told me at the time that he had seen Diane at the county annex pulling plat maps for the area. I stored that away without attaching much weight to it. It was 2019. I had work to do. The first fine letter arrived in June of 2021. It was printed on Crestwood HOA stationery with a seal in the upper corner that looked like it had been designed on a home computer, and it informed me that my shop's exterior signage was in violation of HOA Regulation 4.2, governing commercial signage within the community corridor. The fine was $150. I read it twice. My shop sat outside the Crestwood plat boundary by roughly 40 feet. I had never agreed to any covenant, never signed any addendum, never been handed a copy of Regulation 4.2, and had no legal relationship with their HOA whatsoever. I wrote a short letter in reply, 2 paragraphs, stating my parcel number, the recorded boundary line, and the fact that their jurisdiction ended before it reached my fence. I sent it certified mail and put the fine letter in a new folder labeled Crestwood, along with a copy of my reply. Diane's response arrived 10 days later. She had added $75 in administrative fees to the original fine and noted that my parcel was functionally within the community corridor and therefore subject to community standards. That phrase, functionally within the community corridor, would appear in 5 more letters over the next 14 months. And every time I read it, I thought about how much work it was doing for a phrase with no legal meaning at all. I paid nothing and filed the letter. The second fine came in September of 2021, $200 this time, for what she called an unsecured commercial waste receptacle visible from the community pathway. That was my burn barrel, which sat behind my shop, behind my fence, and was visible from their pathway only if someone pressed their face against the chain link and looked at an angle. I photographed the barrel's location from 4 directions, dated the photos, and added them to the folder. The fine went unanswered. By the end of 2021, I had 4 fine letters, totaling $890, each adding administrative fees the previous one had supposedly generated. I had called my county's code enforcement office in October to ask whether any of the violations were logged in their system. They were not. None of Diane's fines had ever been filed with the county. They existed only on Crestwood stationery. Owen came by the shop in November of that year, and we talked for a while over coffee at my workbench. He had noticed activity on the parcel to my north, a strip of undeveloped ground that technically sat inside the Crestwood plat, but had never been built on. He said Gerald Marsh had been seen walking it with 2 men in hard hats, and that he had heard through someone at the county annex that a subdivision application was being prepared. A new road would need to run through that strip. And that road, Owen said, would need utility access. He paused and looked at his coffee, and then he said, "You know, the only sensible route for that utility run follows the same corridor your father's easement covers." I let that sit for a moment, and then I went and got the easement out of the box. Owen read it standing at my workbench. He read the legal description twice, tracing the boundary language with his finger the way old surveyors do, moving their lips a little. Then he set it down and said the description covered not just Kyle's service line, but the full corridor of the original power run, including the tap that Crestwood's contractor had connected to the gate box back in 2019 when they did the entry upgrade. He said he had noticed it at the time and had even made a note in his survey log, because it struck him as an assumption being made about access nobody had verified. I asked him whether that note was documented. He said it was in a bound field book, dated and signed, at his house. I made another copy of the easement, dated it, added it to the folder with a note of Owen's observation, and went back to work. The fine letters kept coming. February of 2022. A man arrived at my shop on a Wednesday morning. He was wearing a yellow vest and carrying a clipboard, and he introduced himself as being from what he called the Regional Utility Compliance Office. He spoke in the vague, important way of someone who has rehearsed a role rather than trained for it. He walked my exterior perimeter taking notes, asked me several questions about my service panel, and told me there were irregularities in my connection that would require a formal compliance review. He handed me a form that had no agency seal, no file number, and no mailing address. Just a logo I had never seen, printed in the kind of blue that comes from an inkjet on regular paper. I had spent 24 years working beside actual utility inspectors. I knew what their credentials looked like, how they introduced themselves, what forms they carried. This man had none of those things. I asked him for his license number. He told me it wasn't required for a preliminary walk. I asked him which agency he was contracted through. He said it was a third-party arrangement. I thanked him and told him the visit was over. 3 more fine letters arrived within 2 weeks. Total accumulated fines were now $2,340 across 9 notices in 14 months. Each letter referenced the previous ones and added fees. The fake inspector was mentioned in one of them as having confirmed aesthetic compliance deficiencies. I called Owen that evening. He came over the next morning, and I showed him all 9 letters arranged chronologically on my workbench. He picked up one, put it down, picked up another. He said, "Kyle, this whole thing has Gerald's fingerprints on it. You are sitting on the only parcel he can't route around." I drove to the county recorder's office that week. I pulled Gerald's LLC filings. Crestwood Development LLC had submitted a preliminary subdivision plat for the Northern Strip in November 2021, the same month Owen had first mentioned seeing the hard hats. The plat showed a utility corridor running directly through the easement my father had recorded. There was no acknowledgement of the prior easement anywhere in the filing. Either no one had searched the title, or someone had searched it and chosen not to include it. I went home and added a copy of the plat filing to my folder. The fine letters stopped in late 2022. I took no satisfaction from that. When the pressure drops suddenly before a storm, it does not mean the weather is improving. The first Tuesday in March of 2023 was cold and clear. I had left the shop at 5 in the afternoon, driven to the hardware store, picked up a new throttle cable and some carburetor cleaner, and was on my way back when my phone rang. It was Tess. She said, "Dad, the power went out." I asked whether the breakers had tripped. She said she had checked and they were all in the right position. I asked if any of the neighbors' lights were on. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Everything else looks normal out there. Just us." I told her to stay inside, lock the front door, and keep her phone on. She said okay in the particular way she used when she was trying not to sound scared, which meant she was scared. I pushed the speed limit the last 4 miles home. She met me at the door with a flashlight. She had lit 2 candles in the kitchen and had her jacket on. She looked steady, but her jaw was tight, and she handed me the flashlight without a word. I put my hand on her shoulder for a second, then went outside. I was at the meter base with the flashlight in under 2 minutes, and I knew what I was looking at before I finished my crouch. The service entrance cable, the 3 conductors running from the utility company's weatherhead down into my meter box, had been cut clean. Not pulled, not damaged, not failed. Cut with a lineman's knife or a cable cutter at a point just below the weatherhead, leaving the utility side intact and the service side dead. Clean work. Someone who knew what they were doing or had been told exactly what to do. I stood up and walked the perimeter of the fence line with the flashlight. Near the east corner, where the easement corridor ran, I found a section of conduit on the ground and a set of fresh boot prints in the mud along the fence base. Nothing else. No cut lock, no forced gate. They had come in from the easement side, from the strip that Diane's contractor could access from the Crestwood Road without ever touching my gate latch. I went back inside. Tess was sitting at the kitchen table with both hands around a coffee mug. I sat across from her and told her what I'd found. She asked if it was Diane. I said I thought so. She said she wanted me to call the police. I told her I was going to do one better than that. Owen's phone rang 4 times before he picked up, and I told him in 2 sentences what had happened. He said he'd be at my place in 15 minutes. I told him to bring the field book. Owen arrived with his coat still open and set the bound survey log on my kitchen table next to Tess's coffee mug. He had the 2019 entry open to the page where he had recorded the gate tap observation. His handwriting precise and small. The date clear, the note reading that the Crestwood entry gate control box appeared to be drawing from the existing service line in the recorded easement corridor, eastern tap point, with no separate utility application on file. He pointed to his initials and the date and said, "That's your leverage." I had the easement in the folder already. I got the folder. I called Deputy Carla Voss that night. She came out within 40 minutes, walked the meter base with me, photographed the cut, and took a written statement. She was efficient and careful and asked good questions. When I showed her the notice left on my door, the one Diane had taped to the frame, she read it twice without comment. Then I showed her the easement. She read the recording date. She looked at the notice again. She asked me where the easement corridor ran. I showed her on the county plat map I had brought out to the porch. She was quiet for a moment, then said she could not write a trespass charge against me for accessing my own easement, and that the service cut was going to require a call to the county utility board rather than her shift supervisor, because what had been done here crossed into utility interference, which was above her jurisdiction to resolve. I thanked her. She left after making sure Tess and I had a working generator she had confirmed was fueled and safe. We slept that night with the generator running. And in the morning, I called the county utility board and asked for a hearing. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out, on a Thursday morning at the county administrative building. I spent those 3 weeks pulling documentation the way I used to pull wire on a job, deliberately and in sequence, not rushing, checking each connection before I moved to the next. I had Owen file a formal written statement describing his 2019 field observation and attaching a copy of the log page. I pulled the county utility records for the Crestwood gate address and confirmed, in writing from the records office, that no separate service application had ever been filed for the gate box. The gate was drawing power from the shared line in the easement corridor. That was in the county's own records. I had it in hand 3 days before the hearing. I printed a timeline. 9 fines, $4,100 accumulated, 14 months, 0 county code violations on file. The fake inspector. The cut service line. The easement recording year versus the HOA incorporation year, 1987 and 2019. On the same page, side by side. I made 3 copies of everything and put them in 3 separate folders. The morning of the hearing, I drove Tess to school, stopped for coffee, and was at the county building 20 minutes early. Owen met me in the lobby. He had his field book under his arm and a copy of his signed statement in a folder. He said he had seen Gerald's truck in the parking lot. I said I expected that. The hearing room was a conference room off the main administrative corridor, with a long table, 8 chairs, and fluorescent lights overhead. 3 utility board members sat on one side. Deputy Voss sat along the wall as the responding officer of record. I sat across from the board with Owen beside me. Diane and Gerald came in 2 minutes late. She wore a gray blazer and pearls and carried her clipboard as if she had been called to adjudicate rather than answer. Gerald sat 1 seat away from her and said nothing, looking at the table. His attorney sat beside him. The board chair opened by stating the case. Unauthorized service interruption on a private residential and commercial parcel. Complaint filed by the landowner, responding officer present. He asked whether all parties had received the notice of hearing. Everyone confirmed. He looked at me and asked me to present my situation. I laid the 1987 easement on the table first. I slid a copy to the board chair and kept the original in my hand. I said the easement had been recorded at the county clerk's office on March 14, 1987, that it predated the Crestwood development by more than 3 years and predated the HOA's incorporation by 32 years. I said every title search done on the adjacent parcel after 1987 should have shown this recording, because it was a matter of public record. The board chair looked at it. The member to his left looked at it. The member to his right picked up his copy and read the full legal description. Then I laid down the county utility records confirming that the Crestwood front gate box had no separate service application on file and was drawing 340 watts continuous from the line running through the easement corridor, the same line my father had established in 1987 and that I had maintained since 2009. Owen set his field book on the table, open to the 2019 entry. He identified himself, stated his credentials as a retired county surveyor, and read his notation aloud. The gate tap, the date, the easement corridor. No separate application on file. One of the board members said out loud that if the gate was drawing from the easement line and the easement line had been cut by a contractor working at the HOA's direction, then the HOA had effectively interrupted its own power supply. There was a pause in that room that felt like it had weight to it. Not a dramatic pause, not a theatrical one. Just the particular quiet that settles over a table when everyone present realizes simultaneously that the position one party has been holding for 2 years has no floor under it. Diane said, "We were not aware the gate connection ran through that corridor." I put the county utility record in front of her, the one with the tap location and the 340-watt continuous draw stamped by the records office. I said the county had been aware of it since the gate was installed. Gerald's attorney asked for a recess. The board chair said the materials had been submitted in advance and no recess was warranted. He asked Deputy Voss whether the service cut was consistent with a Class C utility interference violation. She said it was, based on her site inspection. The board chair ruled that the easement was controlling, that the service interruption had been unauthorized, and that service to my parcel was to be restored within 48 hours at the HOA's expense. He further noted that the gatebox connection would need to be formally severed and reapplied under a separate account before it could be considered a lawful service draw, and that until that application was approved and the separate meter installed, the gate draw from the easement line was effectively suspended. Gerald stood up before the ruling was finished. He did not say anything. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and walked out. His attorney gathered the papers and followed. Diane sat still for a moment, and then she gathered her clipboard and her copies and left without making eye contact with anyone at the table. Owen sat back in his chair. He said quietly that that was about what he had figured. The county utility crew restored my service on the Saturday of that week. A 2-man team, standard service truck, a new service entrance cable run in 2 hours. I made coffee and brought it out to them, and one of the crew recognized me from my old district, and we talked for a while about line work. Tess came out at one point, still in her school sweatshirt, and watched them finish the connection from the porch. when the meter box powered up and the shop lights came on behind her. She nodded once, the way a person does when something happens that was always going to happen, and went back inside. The HOA front gate lost power the following Monday when the board formally suspended the unauthorized tap pending a new application. That application required approval from the county utility board, and the county utility board had just spent a Thursday morning establishing that the easement corridor was mine. Gerald's LLC had submitted its subdivision plat on the premise that the corridor would be absorbed into the development's utility access. With the easement enforced and its legal scope on the record, that absorption was no longer possible without my agreement. I did not agree. The subdivision plat was withdrawn in April of 2023. The Crestwood Board voted to remove Diane as president at their May meeting. I know this because Owen attended as a resident of the adjacent properties, and he sent me a text that evening that said, simply, 4-1. The utility fraud referral was filed by the board chair's office within a week of the hearing, citing the Class C violation and the fake compliance notice. I have not tracked the outcome of that referral past the initial filing. That part belongs to other people's process. My shop has run uninterrupted since the Saturday the crew restored service. The 9 fine letters are still in the folder, all $4,100 worth, which I have kept because they are a record and records matter. The generator is stored in the back corner of the shop now, fueled and ready, not because I expect to need it again, but because my father taught me you keep the backup maintained whether or not the primary has ever failed. The 1987 easement is back in the fireproof box. I want to tell you the thing my father understood that Diane never bothered to find out, because it is the part that matters for anyone listening to this who owns land or a building or a shop and has ever gotten a letter that has no right to exist. A recorded easement, a recorded deed, a recorded survey. These are not quiet background documents. They are senior to every covenant, regulation, and stationery seal issued after they were stamped and filed. The organization that came after them took title subject to them, whether or not they read the packet. Incuriosity is not a defense. The older instrument wins. Walk your boundaries. Read your deed packet. If someone hands you a fine letter that references a jurisdiction they do not have, send a short certified reply naming your parcel number and the relevant boundary, and put the letter in a labeled folder. Do not pay until you have verified the authority behind the demand. Get your easements in a fireproof box. The documentation habit is not a precaution for people who expect trouble. It is the ordinary practice of someone who intends to keep what they have built. There is a gate at the entry to Crestwood that does not open and close the way it used to. I notice it when I pass. I do not say anything about it. I just drive through my own gate and get to work. If you have dealt with something like this, drop a comment below and tell me what happened. And if you want to hear the story about the county road authority that tried to take 6 feet of my gravel drive based on a map that had been drawn wrong for 40 years, and the neighbor who had kept a copy of the original survey since 1961, subscribe and stay close. That one takes a little longer to tell.